The scream pierced through the dawn silence like a knife, not human, not quite animal, but filled with such raw desperation that David Carter's blood ran cold. Standing at the edge of his cabin's wooden deck, his morning coffee forgotten in his trembling hand, he listened as a cry echoed across the Montana wilderness, bouncing off snow-capped peaks and cutting through the early spring mist. In 15 years of wildlife photography, he had never heard anything quite like it. Stay with us to witness an extraordinary tale of rescue, redemption, and a bond that challenges the very laws of nature, leaving both man and beast forever changed. David's breath caught in his throat as another wail shattered the morning calm. This time he pinpointed its direction, the rapids near Thunder Creek, where the winter melt had turned the usually gentle stream into a roaring torrent. His coffee mug clattered against the deck railing as he dropped it, already moving. The familiar weight of his camera, perpetually slung around his neck even 2 years after retiring, bounced against his chest as he ran. The ground was treacherous, still partially frozen from the overnight chill, but David barely noticed the slick patches beneath his boots. Each stride carried him closer to the desperate sounds, which were growing weaker. His heart pounded against his ribs, not just from exertion but from a deep-seated dread he couldn't explain. Something about that cry spoke to the hollow place inside him, the void that had existed since Sarah's accident. He broke through the tree line, and the sight before him stopped him dead in his tracks. In the churning waters below, a small black shape thrashed against the current. A bear cub, no more than a few months old, fought for its life as the ruthless water tossed it against partially submerged rocks. Its tiny paws clawed desperately at the air, trying to find purchase where there was none. David's mind raced. Where was the mother? His eyes scanned the riverbank, knowing full well that getting between a bear and her cub was as good as signing his own death warrant. But the shoreline remained empty, no protective mother in sight. The cub's cries grew weaker, its movements becoming sluggish as exhaustion set in. "God help me," David whispered, already shrugging off his jacket. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to think this through. The water would be barely above freezing, the current strong enough to pull under a full-grown man. But logic didn't stand a chance against the memory of that horrible night 2 years ago when he'd been too late, too far away to help the person who mattered most. Not this time. The shock of the water nearly stopped his heart. It felt like thousands of ice-cold needles piercing his skin, simultaneously stealing his breath and clouding his vision. The current instantly grabbed him, trying to sweep his feet out from under him, but David was ready. His years of backcountry experience kicked in as he anchored himself against a partially submerged log. The cub was only 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. Each step forward was a battle against nature itself, the water pulling at him with invisible hands, trying to drag him under. His boots scraped against the riverbed as he fought for purchase, his clothes becoming heavier with each passing second. "Hold on," he called out, though he knew the words meant nothing to the struggling animal. The cub's head disappeared beneath the surface, and David's heart stopped. Without thinking, he lunged forward, abandoning his secure position. The current caught him fully now, spinning him, disorienting him. Water filled his nose and mouth as he went under. For a terrifying moment, he was lost in a world of cold and chaos. Then his hand brushed against something soft, fur. He grabbed blindly, his fingers tangling in the thick coat. Using every ounce of strength he possessed, David pulled the cub to his chest and kicked hard toward the surface. They broke through together, David gasping for air, the cub terrifyingly still in his arms. The shore seemed impossibly far away, but a lifetime of mountain living had taught him to respect rather than fight the water's power. He worked with the current, angling them gradually toward the bank while keeping the cub's head above water. When his feet finally found solid ground, David's legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. He stumbled up the rocky shore, cradling his precious cargo. The cub was limp, its small body cold and motionless. Laying it gently on a patch of grass, David's photographer's eye couldn't help but notice the beauty of its face, perfect black fur, small round ears, and a tiny pink tongue slightly protruding from its mouth, a tongue that wasn't moving. The cub wasn't breathing. "No, no, no," David muttered, his frozen fingers pressing against the cub's chest, feeling for a heartbeat. "Don't you dare, not after all this." His own heart seemed to stop as he waited, prayed for any sign of life. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over them both, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if this tiny life could be saved. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Subscribe to witness an extraordinary journey of survival, where one man's desperate rescue becomes a tale of healing, hope, and the unbreakable bond between two lost souls fighting to find their way back to life. Time seemed to freeze as David stared at the motionless cub, his own breathing ragged from the rescue. His wilderness first-aid training crashed back into his mind like a tidal wave. Without hesitation, he placed his hands on the cub's small chest, trying to judge the right amount of pressure for such a tiny body. "Come on, little one," he whispered. Beginning compressions, the cub's fur was cold and wet beneath his palms, its small frame so fragile that David feared he might cause more harm than good. But the alternative was unthinkable. He'd already lost too much in his life to let go now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he counted silently, memories of his certification course mingling with the desperate present. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice breaking. He tilted the cub's head back slightly, cleared its airway, and breathed gently into its snout. The small chest rose and fell with his effort but showed no signs of independent movement. Again, he started compressions, his arms aching from the cold and exertion. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind from that day 5 years ago when she convinced him to take the wilderness first aid course. "You never know when you might need to save a life, David," she'd said, her eyes twinkling with that characteristic optimism he'd fallen in love with. He'd taken the course to please her, never imagining he'd use it to save a bear cub. Another breath. Another round of compressions. David's world narrowed to the singular task, this desperate attempt to keep death at bay. His clothes were soaked, his body shivering violently, but he barely noticed. "Please," he begged, no longer sure who he was talking to, the cub, the universe, or Sarah's memory. Suddenly, the small body beneath his hands convulsed. Water gurgled from the cub's mouth, and it let out a weak cough. David's heart leaped as the cub drew in a shuddering breath on its own, then another. "That's it," he encouraged, gently rolling the cub onto its side to help clear its lungs. "That's it, little fighter." The cub's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises that seemed to hold a world of confusion and fear. It tried to move but could barely lift its head, letting out a pitiful whimper that tugged at David's heart. Without thinking, he slipped off his outer shirt, leaving only his wet thermal layer, and wrapped it around the trembling creature. "Easy now," he soothed, his photographer's instincts taking over as he assessed the cub's condition. Besides being half-drowned, it was clearly undernourished, its ribs visible beneath the wet fur. No sign of the mother bear still, which could explain both the cub's condition and its presence near the rapids. Had it been trying to cross the creek to follow its mother, or had it simply fallen while searching for food? The cub's eyes locked onto David's face, and something in that gaze struck him to his core. There was a recognition there, an awareness that seemed beyond mere animal instinct. The cub made another weak sound, but this time it wasn't fearful, it was almost questioning. "You're safe now," David found himself saying, even as his rational mind reminded him that this was a wild animal, not a pet. He needed to get it to someone who could properly care for it. The nearest wildlife veterinarian was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, about an hour's drive down the mountain. If anyone would know what to do, it would be her. Carefully, he gathered the cub in his arms, expecting resistance, but whether from exhaustion or some inexplicable trust, it remained still, its small head resting against his chest. The steady beat of its heart against his arm was the most reassuring thing he'd felt in years. The walk back to his cabin was slow and careful. Each step had to be measured to avoid jostling his precious cargo. The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the mist and beginning to warm the air. David's wet clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin, but the bundle in his arms had stopped shivering quite so violently. Inside the cabin, he headed straight for the fireplace, where embers still glowed from the previous night. One-handed, he stoked the fire back to life, adding kindling and small logs until warmth began to fill the room. Only then did he settle the cub onto a blanket near the hearth. The cub watched his every move with those intelligent eyes, tracking him as he quickly changed into dry clothes and gathered supplies. A shallow bowl of warm water, clean towels, his first aid kit, anything he thought might help. When he knelt beside the cub again, it didn't flinch away. "You need a name," David murmured as he began to gently dry the cub's fur. "Can't keep calling you little one." The cub's ears perked up at his voice, and it made a soft sound, almost like a grunt. Despite everything, David found himself smiling. "How about Scout? You look like a scout to me." Scout. The name felt right somehow. Scout tried to sit up, managing to raise his head a few inches before exhaustion took over. David caught him before he could fall, supporting the small body with one hand. "Whoa there, buddy. Take it easy. We've got time." Time. The word echoed in David's mind as he cradled Scout, feeling the cub's breathing even out into what he hoped was healing sleep. He hadn't felt like he had time for anything since Sarah's death. Each day had been a blur, one bleeding into the next as he went through the motions of living without really being alive. But now, watching Scout's small chest rise and fall, feeling the trust this wild creature had placed in him, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years: purpose. Scout needed him. And maybe, just maybe, he needed Scout too. As the fire crackled and morning light streamed through the cabin windows, David settled in to watch over his unexpected charge, unaware that this was just the beginning of a journey that would heal them both. The examination room at Montana Wildlife Center smelled of antiseptic and pine, an oddly comforting combination that reminded David of his own darkroom chemicals mixed with forested air. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's experienced hands moved gently over Scout's small body as the cub lay sedated on the metal table. David hadn't left Scout's side during the hour-long drive down the mountain, the cub's quiet whimpers during the journey tearing at his heart. "Well," Dr. Mitchell said, straightening up and adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses, "he's definitely malnourished, probably hasn't eaten properly in days. There's some minor bruising from the rapids, but nothing broken. The bigger concern is his age. He's too young to be without his mother." She paused, her green eyes meeting David's. "You said there was no sign of her?" David shook his head, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I searched the area after getting him stabilized, no tracks, no signs of a den, nothing. The words felt heavy in his mouth. He'd spent 2 hours combing the riverbank, hoping to find some trace of Scout's mother, but the wilderness had kept its secrets. Bears don't usually abandon their cubs without reason, Dr. Mitchell mused, her voice thoughtful and tinged with concern. Especially not this time of year. She might have been injured or... She left the darker possibility unspoken, but David understood. Poaching, though illegal, still happened in the more remote areas. Scout stirred slightly under the doctor's touch, and David instinctively moved closer, placing a gentle hand on the cub's head. The fur was softer now, clean of river mud and properly dried. "What are his chances?" he asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Dr. Mitchell's face softened. "Better, thanks to you. Another few minutes in that water." She shook her head. "But he's got a fighting spirit, I can see it in his eyes when he's awake. The next 48 hours will be crucial. We need to get his body temperature fully stabilized and start getting some nutrients into him." "I want to help," David said quickly, surprising himself with the intensity of his own voice. "I have experience with wildlife. I was a photographer for National Geographic, spent years observing bears in their natural habitat. I know their behaviors, their needs." The doctor raised an eyebrow, a hint of recognition crossing her face. "David Carter? I think I've seen your work. That series on Glacier National Park's grizzlies was remarkable." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Actually, this might work out better than our standard protocol." She moved to a cabinet, pulling out supplies as she spoke. "Normally, we'd keep him here, but we're overwhelmed with early spring rescues. 3 orphan moose calves came in yesterday, and our staff is stretched thin." Turning back to David, she added, "If you're willing to take on the responsibility, Scout might do better in a quieter environment, less stress, more one-on-one care." Hope bloomed in David's chest, unexpected and warm. "I'll do whatever it takes." The words came without hesitation, and he knew they were true. Something about this small creature had awakened a part of him he'd thought long dead. Over the next hour, Dr. Mitchell showed David how to prepare Scout's special formula, administer medications, and check vital signs. She emphasized the importance of maintaining distance despite the temptation to comfort him. Scout needed to remain wild, capable of returning to his natural habitat once strong enough. "Remember," she cautioned, handing David a thick folder of instructions and her emergency contact numbers, "the goal is rehabilitation, not domestication. It won't be easy, there will be setbacks, and at some point, you'll have to let him go." David nodded, but his throat felt tight. He already knew letting go would be the hardest part. Back at the cabin that evening, Scout showed the first signs of his remarkable spirit. Still weak but more alert, he watched David's every move with those intelligent eyes. When David approached with the bottle of formula, Scout didn't just accept it, he reached for it with his small paws, holding it himself as he drank. "Well, look at you," David chuckled, snapping a quick photo with his phone. "Independent already." The sight stirred something in his memory, a conversation with Sarah about having children someday. They'd never gotten the chance. Now, here he was, playing surrogate parent to a bear cub of all things. Scout finished his meal and attempted to stand, his legs wobbling like a newborn colt. David watched, hands hovering nearby but resisting the urge to help. The cub managed 3 shaky steps before plopping down with a surprised huff that sounded almost human. That's it, David encouraged softly. Small steps, buddy. We've got time. As night fell, bringing with it a gentle spring rain that drummed against the cabin's roof, David made Scout comfortable in the special enclosure he'd prepared, warm but separate from the human living space, as Dr. Mitchell had instructed. The cub had other ideas. Every time David walked away, Scout would let out a plaintive cry that seemed to echo the loneliness in David's own heart. Finally, David compromised, moving his reading chair next to the enclosure. Just for tonight, he told Scout firmly, trying to convince himself as much as the cub. Scout responded by pressing against the side of the enclosure closest to David and promptly falling asleep. David watched the steady rise and fall of Scout's chest, remembering Dr. Mitchell's warnings about attachment. But as the rain fell and the fire crackled, he realized it might already be too late. In just 2 days, the small creature had awakened something in him, a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, a chance to nurture and protect. Sweet dreams, Scout, he whispered, allowing himself to relax for the first time since the rescue. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in this quiet moment, David felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Outside, the wilderness breathed its ancient rhythm, and inside, 2 wounded souls began to heal each other, one small step at a time. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as David sorted through a box he hadn't opened in 2 years. Scout watched from his corner, now strong enough to move around freely within his designated space, his curious eyes following David's every movement. At the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old magazines featuring his wildlife photography, lay Sarah's camera, the one she'd been using that final day. She would have loved you, David said softly, running his fingers over the camera's worn surface. Scout tilted his head, letting out a gentle whimper that seemed to acknowledge David's pain. She always said animals could sense good souls. Guess she was right about that too. A sharp knock at the door startled them both. Scout retreated to the back of his enclosure while David quickly wiped his eyes and went to answer it. 2 rangers stood on his porch, their expressions serious. "Morning, Mr. Carter," the older ranger said, introducing himself as Mike Thompson. "We're following up on reports of increased bear activity in the area. Female black bear, likely searching for something." His eyes drifted past David to where Scout was visible in his enclosure. Or someone. David's heart raced. Scout's mother? Possibly, Thompson replied. She's been spotted near residential areas, which isn't typical behavior. Bears don't usually stray this close to human settlements unless they're desperate. He paused, studying David's face. Dr. Mitchell informed us about the cub. How's he doing? Better every day, David answered, pride creeping into his voice. He's eating well, gaining strength. Still needs round-the-clock care, but he's fighting hard. The younger ranger, whose nameplate read Jenkins, stepped forward. Sir, if this is the mother bear, we need to consider reintroduction. It could be dangerous for everyone if she keeps searching populated areas. David's chest tightened. He knew they were right. Reuniting Scout with his mother would be ideal, but something felt off. Why wasn't she there when he was drowning? Why didn't she come back to that area? I searched for hours and found no signs of her. Thompson shook his head. Bears are complex creatures, Mr. Carter. Could be any number of reasons. We'll keep monitoring the situation. Meanwhile, document everything about the cub's development. If we locate the mother and confirm it's her, we'll need to move quickly. After the rangers left, David sank into his chair, emotions warring inside him. Scout approached the edge of his enclosure, pressing his nose against the mesh. Without thinking, David reached out, letting Scout sniff his fingers, a gesture that had become their ritual of trust. "What am I going to do with you, buddy?" he whispered. Scout responded by gently mouthing his fingers, not biting, just connecting. The gesture brought unexpected tears to David's eyes. "You're not supposed to trust me this much. You're supposed to stay wild." As if understanding, Scout pulled back slightly, but his eyes never left David's face. Those eyes, so much wisdom in them, so much understanding, they reminded him of Sarah's eyes in the strangest way, how they seemed to see right through to his soul. David pulled out his phone, scrolling to a photo he rarely looked at, him and Sarah on their last anniversary, both laughing as they tried to take a selfie with a moose photobombing in the background. "That was 3 months before the accident," he told Scout, his voice thick. "We were supposed to go to Yellowstone the following spring." She wanted to photograph the bear cubs emerging from their dens. Scout pressed closer to the mesh, and David found himself continuing, words he hadn't spoken aloud in 2 years pouring out. He told Scout about the icy road, the failed brakes, the call that came too late. About how he retreated to this cabin afterward, shutting out the world, letting his career slip away. "I couldn't save her," he whispered, the admission hanging heavy in the air. "But I saved you. Maybe that's why you were sent to me. Maybe." A crash from outside cut him off. Scout's ears perked up, his body tensing. David moved to the window, scanning the yard. A large dark shape moved through the trees at the edge of his property. His breath caught. It was a black bear, and it was heading toward the cabin. Scout began pacing his enclosure, making small distressed sounds. The bear outside raised its head, seeming to smell the air. David's mind raced. Was this Scout's mother? But something felt wrong. The bear's movements were aggressive, not searching, and it looked too small to be a mother bear. "Easy, Scout," David murmured, moving slowly to get his bear spray from the shelf. "Stay quiet." But Scout grew more agitated, his cries getting louder. The bear outside turned toward the sound, and David's blood ran cold. He could see its face clearly now. This was a young male, likely drawn by the scent of the formula David used to feed Scout. The bear took a step toward the cabin, then another. David's hand tightened on the bear spray. He'd photographed enough bears to know how dangerous a hungry male could be. Especially one bold enough to approach human dwellings. Scout suddenly let out a sharp bark-like sound David had never heard him make before. The male bear hesitated, seeming confused by the noise. David used the moment to slip outside, positioning himself between the bear and his cabin. His heart pounded, but years of wildlife experience guided his movements. "Hey," he shouted, making himself appear larger. "Get out of here." He raised his arms, clapping loudly. The bear rose slightly on its hind legs, assessing the threat. From inside, Scout's cries grew more urgent. Time seemed to slow as David stared into the wild bear's eyes, seeing none of the intelligence or trust he'd grown accustomed to in Scout's gaze. This was raw nature, beautiful and dangerous. For a moment, he thought the bear would charge. Instead, it dropped back to all fours and slowly backed away, eventually turning to lumber into the forest. David's legs shook as he went back inside. Scout was pressed against his enclosure, whimpering softly. Without thinking about regulations or boundaries, David opened the enclosure door and sat inside. Scout immediately climbed into his lap, his small body trembling. "It's okay," David soothed, stroking the soft fur. I've got you. I won't let anything happen to you." As Scout's trembling subsided, David realized he was making a promise he might not be able to keep. But in that moment, holding this wild creature who trusted him so completely, he knew he would do anything to protect him, even if it meant eventually letting him go. Spring had fully embraced the Montana wilderness, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and wildflowers, when David noticed the first real sign that Scout was changing. The cub stood at the edge of the cabin's clearing, his nose high in the air, testing the wind in a way that was purely wild. His small body, now strong and healthy, tensed with an energy that seemed to come from something ancient and untamed. "You smell it too, don't you?" David asked softly, watching Scout from the porch. The morning air carried the scent of the awakening forest, of new growth and distant rain. But there was something else today, a musky odor that made Scout pace restlessly. Somewhere in the distance, a bear had marked territory. Dr. Mitchell's words from her last visit echoed in David's mind. He's approaching an age where his natural instincts will begin to take over. We need to be ready. She had given him a knowing look. Both of us need to be ready. Scout had grown remarkably over the past weeks, his once fragile frame now rippling with the beginning of muscle. His movements were confident and sure. The formula bottles had been replaced with a carefully planned diet that mimicked what he would eat in the wild. David had even begun hiding Scout's food around the property, encouraging him to forage as he would naturally. But it was the small moments that threatened to break David's heart, how Scout still looked to him during thunderstorms, how he would press his head against David's hand in the quiet evening hours, seeking connection even as his wild nature called more strongly each day. A sharp crack from the forest edge drew their attention. Scout's head snapped toward the sound, his body lowering instinctively. David reached for his binoculars, scanning the trees. Through the leaves, he caught glimpses of movement, a group of deer passing through, their own young following close behind. Scout took a step toward the forest, then another, his movements fluid and instinctual in a way David had never seen before. Then, surprisingly, he stopped and looked back at David, as if seeking permission or reassurance. "Go on," David encouraged, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay." The cub moved forward with growing confidence, disappearing into the underbrush. David's heart raced as he lost sight of Scout, but he forced himself to stay on the porch. This was natural. This was necessary. Still, his hands gripped the railing until his knuckles turned white. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Scout emerged from the forest. His eyes were bright with excitement, his small chest heaving slightly. He bounded back to the cabin with an energy that reminded David of the playful cub he'd first rescued. But there was something different now, a new awareness in his movements. "Had quite an adventure, did you?" David smiled, kneeling to examine Scout for any injuries. The cub allowed the inspection but seemed distracted, his attention repeatedly drawn back to the forest. David's throat tightened. "You'll have many more adventures soon enough." That afternoon, as David worked on organizing his old photography equipment, something he'd been inspired to do more often lately, he heard Scout making unusual sounds from his outdoor enclosure. Looking out, he saw the cub practicing his growl at a squirrel that had ventured too close. The sight was both amusing and bittersweet. "Practicing your scary bear voice, huh?" David called out. Scout turned to him, looking almost embarrassed at being caught. But then he drew himself up and let out another growl, this one stronger than the last. The squirrel darted away, and Scout's chest puffed with pride. David laughed, but his eyes stung with unshed tears. Every day brought new signs that Scout was becoming what he was always meant to be, a wild bear. The small, helpless cub he'd pulled from the river was transforming before his eyes. Later that evening, as the sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, David sat on his porch steps reviewing the rehabilitation guidelines Dr. Mitchell had given him. Scout lay nearby, content but alert, his eyes regularly scanning their surroundings. The sound of wolves howling in the distance made his ears prick up, but he showed no fear. "You know," David said quietly, "I used to think healing meant forgetting. After Sarah died, I tried to pack away every memory, every photograph, every reminder of joy." He looked at Scout, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. "But you taught me something different. You showed me that healing means growing stronger, not forgetting who you are or where you came from." Scout stood and moved closer, resting his head briefly against David's knee, a gesture that had become less frequent but more precious as the cub grew more independent. The trust was still there, but it was changing, evolving into something that honored both their connection and Scout's true nature. A sound from deep in the forest caught their attention, a low grunt that made Scout's entire body stiffen. David recognized it immediately, a female bear, probably the one the rangers had been tracking. Scout rose slowly, his nose working the air, his body trembling slightly. David held his breath, wondering if this would be the moment, if Scout would finally answer the call of his own kind. The female bear called again, closer now. Scout took several steps toward the forest, then looked back at David with an expression that seemed to hold all the complexity of their shared journey. "It's okay," David whispered, though his heart was breaking. "You can go look. You can always come back." Scout hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and trotted toward the tree-line with purpose. At the edge of the forest, he paused one final time, silhouetted against the dying light. Then, with a grace that spoke to his true nature, he slipped into the gathering darkness. David sat alone on the porch steps, his vision blurring as he stared at the spot where Scout had disappeared. The night air grew cooler around him, carrying the sounds and scents of the wilderness, Scout's real home. After an hour, the cub hadn't returned, but David remained, watching and waiting, understanding that each moment of Scout's absence was both an ending and a beginning. Dawn broke over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. David hadn't slept, his eyes fixed on the forest edge where Scout had disappeared the night before. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold, untouched. As sunlight crept across the clearing, movement caught his eye. Scout emerged from the trees, his fur damp with morning dew. Relief flooded David's chest as the cub bounded toward the cabin with a new confidence in his step. But something was different. Scout's eyes held a wild gleam, and his movements carried a fresh awareness of the world around him. He had tasted freedom, and both of them knew nothing would be the same. "Well, welcome back, buddy," David said softly, kneeling to greet him. Scout pressed his head briefly against David's hand, a gesture now rare enough to make David's throat tight, before turning to look back at the forest with obvious longing. Dr. Mitchell's arrival later that morning felt like both a blessing and a curse. She examined Scout thoroughly, her experienced hands gentle but professional. "His muscle tone is excellent," she noted. "And his instincts are clearly developing. The fact that he returned after hearing another bear is actually a good sign. He's learning to navigate both worlds, which will help him transition." "When?" David managed to ask, the word barely making it past the lump in his throat. "Soon," she replied kindly. The longer we wait, the harder it will be for both of you. She placed a hand on David's shoulder. You've done an amazing job, David. But the final act of love in wildlife rehabilitation is letting go. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. David worked with Dr. Mitchell to identify the perfect release site, far enough from human settlements but close to areas where female bears had been spotted. Scout spent more time exploring the forest, his returns to the cabin becoming less frequent but somehow more precious. On the morning chosen for Scout's release, David woke to find the cub sitting at his bedroom door, almost as if he knew. "One last adventure together, huh?" David said, his voice breaking slightly. Scout's soft whimpers seemed to echo the emotion. They loaded into David's truck, Scout settling into the familiar spot on the passenger seat. The drive into the deeper wilderness felt both too long and too short. David's camera sat between them. Dr. Mitchell had suggested documenting the release for the Wildlife Center's records, but David knew he needed these final moments captured for himself as well. The spot they had chosen was perfect, a sheltered valley rich with berry bushes and natural cover, close to a clean water source. As David parked the truck, a sound made them both freeze, a deep grunt from the woods, followed by another. Two bears emerged in the distance, one larger than the other, both female. Scout's entire body tensed, his nose working overtime to process the scents carried on the wind. David's hands shook as he reached for his camera, forcing himself to document these final moments through the viewfinder, a familiar barrier that helped him maintain his composure. But nature had one final surprise in store. As David opened the truck door, movement in his peripheral vision made him spin around. A massive male bear burst from the undergrowth, charging directly toward them with frightening speed. In the split second it took David to process the danger, Scout was already moving. The small bear threw himself between David and the charging adult, rising onto his hind legs and letting out a roar that seemed impossible from his young throat. The larger bear skidded to a stop, clearly shocked by the unexpected display of courage from a cub. David's photographer's instincts took over, his camera capturing the incredible moment even as his heart raced. Scout held his ground, his small frame somehow appearing larger through sheer force of will. The adult bear assessed the situation, looking confused by this unusual standoff. Finally, with a dismissive grunt, it turned and ambled away. Scout remained standing until the danger had passed, then dropped to all fours and turned to check on David. Their eyes met in a moment of pure understanding. Scout had just repaid the rescue that had begun their journey together. "Thank you," David whispered, tears flowing freely now. Scout pressed his head against David's leg one final time, then turned to face the valley. The female bears were still visible in the distance, and Scout's entire body thrummed with obvious longing. "Go on," David encouraged, his voice thick with emotion. "It's time." Scout took a few steps forward, then looked back, his eyes holding a wisdom and gratitude that transcended species. David raised his camera, capturing that final glance, the perfect mixture of wild nature and profound connection. Then Scout was running, his powerful young body carrying him swiftly toward his new life. The female bears watched his approach, and to David's amazement, the larger one moved to meet him. Through his telephoto lens, he watched as she gently sniffed Scout, who displayed perfect submissive behavior. Then, incredibly, she guided him toward a berry bush, showing him how to select the ripest fruit. David photographed until Scout disappeared into the forest with his new family, his camera finally lowering only when he could no longer see any movement among the trees. The valley seemed impossibly quiet. Back at the cabin that evening, David sat on his porch, a framed photograph in his hands, Sarah on their last hike together, laughing as she pointed out a bear in the distance. Next to it, he placed the newly printed photo of Scout's final look, goodbye. 2 moments of perfect love, both ending too soon, but leaving him forever changed. His phone buzzed, Dr. Mitchell sending the GPS coordinates from Scout's tracking collar. The signal showed healthy movement, suggesting Scout was adapting well to his new freedom. David smiled through his tears, remembering the frightened cub he'd pulled from the river. He'd thought he was saving a life. He hadn't known he was also saving himself. The sun set over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in the same colors that had welcomed Scout into David's life. Somewhere in that vast landscape, a young bear was beginning his true journey. And in a cabin at the forest's edge, a man who had forgotten how to live was finally ready to begin again.